otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in this episode I'm pleased to have a conversation with Billy Jacobson. Billy has experience with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act from a number of vantage points that few can really claim. He's been an assistant chief for FCPA enforcement in the DOJ fraud section. He's been a senior vice president and co-general counsel and chief compliance officer for Weatherford International, a large oil and gas company that does business all over the world. And currently, he's a lawyer in private practice at Orrick and was previously a lawyer in private practice at other firms. Thank you for joining me, Billy.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to talk to you. Like I said in the introduction there, your experience with Foreign Corrupt Practices Act issues from those various vantage points, I think, provide you some unique insight. And certainly a recent development in this space was the Department of Justice releasing on April 5th a policy document titled the Fraud Section's FCPA Enforcement Plan and Guidance. And included within that policy document, perhaps the most notable aspect of that policy document was the DOJ's so-called pilot program. What do you think, or who do you think perhaps motivated the DOJ to release this document a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, although there's been some media reports lately that perhaps the chief of the fraud section, Andrew Weissman, and the assistant attorney general over the criminal division, Leslie Caldwell, were the primary movers behind the pilot program. But then again, the same media reports said that perhaps Andrew and Leslie were hoping for a more robust version of the pilot program, but got vetoed by the Deputy Attorney General, Sally Yates. So I don't know any of that firsthand, but that has been reported in the press.
Yeah, and just for listeners' benefit, Andrew Weissman rejoined the DOJ fraud section in January 2015. Prior to that, he had a couple of different positions, including in this context, wrote what largely motivated, at least I think, the Senate FCPA hearing and follow-up House FCPA hearing in 2010 and 2011, suggesting various FCPA reforms. So, yeah, I think it is at least part of the conversation and perhaps relevant that the policy document, does bear his name.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. You know, as an attorney in private practice, you often represent the views of your client. So I don't know that we can 100% accord or impute onto Andrew the views of the Chamber of Commerce, who was his client at the time. But then again, if he vehemently disagreed with them, he probably wouldn't have been representing them in that capacity. So I think it's probable that he has that some of his own personal views were wrapped up in that Chamber of Commerce representation, and then, of course, came with him to the fraud section when he joined as the chief.
Yeah, fair point. Now, even before the pilot program was announced a couple of weeks ago, you commented in various capacities and in different writing about perhaps how the DOJ could best incentivize corporate compliance and other suggested reforms. And in commenting on the pilot program, you took pen to paper again, or at least figuratively, and stated that the pilot program falls short of the DOJ accomplishing its intended goal and is certainly not the bold policy pronouncement for which many were hoping for. Can you elaborate on that comment and more broadly what you think perhaps that bold policy program might have been?
Yeah, sure. So I feel quite strongly that the more that DOJ and the SEC empower companies to be on the front lines of anti-corruption, the more the more impact they will have ultimately. And certainly, it's beyond doubt, I think, that the rise in corporate enforcement of the FCPA, starting in 2005, 2006, really brought with it this broad anti-corruption fervor and this broad anti-corruption and compliance movement, which has been very impactful and great, in most cases, and great for the world, really, because it started a snowball effect that we're seeing cascading really eastward from the U.S. heading east to UK, Western Europe. We're even seeing signs of life that I think emanate from this original move by DOJ in places such as the Middle East and China and so forth. And none of that is without fault and without hiccups, but there seems to be a growing global anti-corruption trend. And I think it's fair to attribute that to the DOJ's actions in 2005, 6, 7, etc. So what had been done in the past is past. DOJ needs to reboot, and I'll focus on DOJ for purposes of these comments, but I often could include the SEC as well. Sure. I think DOJ needs to sort of reboot for the world that we're living in now, and the world we're living in now is one that they helped create, and it's one where big Western companies and increasingly big Eastern companies are taking this stuff very seriously, and they're implementing robust compliance programs, and they're cracking down on employees who violate anti-corruption standards. And one way to recognize that would be for DOJ to, as I've called for, implement a new policy around FCPA enforcement, but as you suggested, one that goes further than the current policy that was issued a couple of weeks ago. So I wrote an article in 2012 that I think still holds water today, setting forth a five criteria, and if those 5 criteria are met by companies, then the companies would not be prosecuted. And I think DOJ can implement this sort of policy without any new legislation, just like they are implementing the pilot program that you mentioned that was passed a few weeks ago. The 5 criteria would be as follows. In order for a company to not be prosecuted, the company must voluntarily disclose the violation. The potential breach must not involve senior leaders within the company, truly senior leaders. So the C-suite and the board of directors must not have been involved in the conduct. Third, the company must cooperate fully with the government, including providing evidence against individuals. So sort of predating the Yates memo, I included that as a criteria. Number 4, the company must agree to implement appropriate remedial measures to mitigate the chances for future violations. And 5, prior to discovering the misconduct, the company must have implemented a robust compliance program. So my thinking was and still is, that if a company can meet those 5 criteria, there should not be a corporate prosecution. But what should there be? There should be prosecution of individuals. I think DOJ agrees by virtue of the Yates memo, that the single most effective way to deter FCPA violations is to put as many culpable individuals in jail as possible. Nothing wakes up the C-suite more than the idea of other executives going to jail. And so that can happen under my proposal, and should happen. A company can't, while a company shouldn't be prosecuted if they meet these 5 criteria, they also shouldn't be able to get away with their ill-gotten gains. And so through a civil proceeding, the profits made by a company via their illegal conduct should be disgorged, much the way that SEC disgorgement works now. The DOJ has the ability through civil proceedings to do the same thing. So that was part of my proposal as well.
Well, there's obviously a lot of overlap between what you just described and what is articulated in the pilot program. I guess the major difference is the pilot program merely holds out a so-called declination as just one possibility. The other possibility, of course, being a reduction in the amount of settlement amount, whether it's 50% if it includes a voluntary disclosure, cooperation, and remediation, or merely 25% if it's cooperation and remediation in the absence of voluntary disclosure. So is that what you see as really the major difference there? Is your proposal is a so-called declination, whereas the DOJ's proposal, a declination is merely just a may consider factor. Is that the right way to look at it?
I think it is, and it's a major difference because it does not give nearly the level of transparency or assurance that companies would be looking for in doing their should we disclose or should we not disclose calculation. And frankly, I don't think the pilot program has added much, if anything, to that discussion and that debate that takes place in C-suites when these violations are discovered. As you noted, the new program says that DOJ may accord up to a 50% reduction. So it doesn't even say they will accord even a 50% reduction, just may accord a 50% reduction to the bottom end of the sentencing guideline fine range. It also says that generally a monitor will not be appointed. So again, giving themselves lots of wiggle room. And then the DOJ will consider a declination. So really hasn't added much. I mean, those things are not different. They're prior to this pilot program, many companies had received discounts off the bottom end of the fine range. Many companies who voluntarily disclosed had not had monitors appointed. And of course, in many cases, DOJ considered a declination. So very little change as a result of this pilot program, unfortunately.
No, and I completely agree with that. And just for listeners' benefits, I've been writing extensively about these same issues in the last couple of weeks, and people who are calling the pilot program a big deal, a monumental shift in DOJ policy, I really question how knowledgeable they were about DOJ practice and policy prior to April 5th. So, hearing that same conclusion from someone like you, I think is very notable. Now, your recent writing on this, as you previously indicated, was very much consistent with a 2012 proposal you made, and you've outlined the specifics there. And the title of that article that I think appeared in a Bloomberg publication was No Legislation Necessary. And again, what you're describing here is changes in just DOJ internal policy. And I commented at the time on your policy and still believe that while the factors you mentioned are, good factors to consider, that perhaps if the goal is to empower companies, perhaps if the goal is to get the attention of the board of directors and other C-suite executives, do we need more than just a change in internal policy? And here I ask you to share your insights from when you indeed were in-house and having conversations with the board and business executives, do they respond to a change in internal discretionary DOJ policy, or could perhaps these objectives be better advanced through an actual amendment to the FCPA itself?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've read some of your pieces about arguing for new legislation, and I'm sympathetic to the argument. I think on balance, though, I prefer the approach of changing DOJ policy, and maybe it's the former prosecutor in me wanting the wiggle room if circumstances change. It's hard to go back to Congress and open up the FCPA, especially the current Congress that we have, which doesn't appear to want to do much on any issues.
No doubt about that. You're absolutely correct on that standpoint, yeah.
And then once you do open up the FCPA, what other changes might be made? And, it might, some other issue might garner favor with the prevailing party at the time, and, lots of unintended consequences could flow. So my view is if a change in legislation is not required in order to make this impact, then it's not worth doing, because it's a much more laborious process and it's a much more unpredictable process. So if a change in DOJ policy can affect the same end, then that's the way I would go.
So if I understand your preference for the internal DOJ policy change only, it's not so much a disagreement with the merits of a so-called compliance defense. It's perhaps just a recognition that as a practical matter, changing the FCPA is not feasible. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that sort of the gist of it?
That's most of it, but again, I go back to where I said as a former prosecutor, maybe I want some more flexibility. So we've seen a sea change in how foreign bribery is treated since 2004. So that's been 12 years now, which is a nice long time frame, and we sort of know where things we know where things were, we know where things are, but we don't really know where things will be. We think we do. We always think we can tell the future, but we're usually wrong as a society about that sort of thing. So, in 2025, things may look very different. And DOJ, even if my policy was implemented by DOJ in 2016, perhaps by 2025 or 2026, things have changed somewhat. And would that mean we'd have to go back to Congress again and have another amendment of the FCPA, or again, it would be much easier for DOJ just to alter their policy?
Right. Well, at least as to a compliance defense, as I've written and talked about before, to the extent the FCPA would indeed contain a compliance defense, it would really make the FCPA more consistent with the FCPA-like laws of many of the peer nations in the OECD convention, several of which have compliance-like concepts embedded in
and I agree with those
laws.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to cut you off. I agree with those 100%, but those countries had the advantage in some ways of passing their legislation in a more mature environment, in a much more mature anti-corruption environment, because the UK, for example, waited until 2010 to pass the UK Bribery Act, whereas our FCPA has been around since 1977. They were able to fit the statute more to the times, the current times, whereas our statute was fit to the times of 1977, and then there were a few amendments that tweaked it in 88 and 98. So if we were passing that legislation today, if we were passing the FCPA today, I probably would argue for a compliance defense to be written into the legislation, because we don't have that opportunity, and we don't need to change the statute in order to affect the end. I just don't think it's necessary, and I kind of like the flexibility of doing it through DOJ policy.
That's an excellent point, and you sometimes see people talk about facilitation payments using the same analogy there. It's like, well, why does the FCPA, at least as written, technically exempt facilitation payments, but so many of these other countries outrightly prohibit them. And to your point, I do think that that is largely a reflection of when those laws came to be enacted, as you indicated, during a time when anti-bribery enforcement was much more mature than in 1977 or even 1988 when the standalone facilitation payments exception was enacted.
Right, and the facilitation payment exception and the implementation it's a good sort of case study of where corporate America and increasingly Western corporates generally have gotten ahead of DOJ in terms of the anti-corruption compliance world, because most, as you know, Mike, most Western companies now with robust anti-corruption programs, they will not allow facilitating payments, even though the DOJ defends the facilitating payments exception in the statute and doesn't want to open up the statute to amend it. And of course, DOJ itself frowns upon facilitating payments. They just don't want to amend the statute. So it's an interesting area where corporates have been out ahead of the DOJ, and we see a real change in the world. I don't want to overstate it, but I think there's a change in the world because of that. And I think we could see a similar impact in an even bigger way if we implemented this sort of compliance defense policy, if DOJ did so.
Mm-hmm. Now, one I guess, drawback of merely DOJ internal policies are these internal policies are largely a reflection of the people who occupy those, policy-setting positions at a particular moment in time. And regardless of who our next president is going to be, I think if prior practice is any indication, the heads of the Department of Justice and others in policy positions are, pretty much going to change, come 2017. And do you think thus perhaps the Yates memo or even this pilot program may be short-lived and not continued by the next crop of DOJ leaders?
Yeah, great question. The pilot program is called the pilot program, right? So
right.
They're by definition, they're saying this is a one-year thing, and let's see how it goes. Most changes that are put into place by DOJ in this area, most changes to the principles of federal prosecution, which, the Holder memo and then the Phillip memo and the Yates memo, and I think I've missed a few along the way, with these deputy attorneys general issuing new versions of the principles of federal prosecution. They change over time, but only around the margins, and the gist of it has been toward considering more factors and sort of a tough on corporate crime trajectory. And I don't think there have been radical changes. So I think if we had the sort of policy that I'm arguing for, if it did come into effect and was incorporated into DOJ policy, I don't think it would be vulnerable to the whims of whatever administration comes in next. I think DOJ has done a good job at not bending to political winds in this area dramatically, regardless of whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. It's been pretty consistent, and it's evolved, but slowly. And I think that's by, in large measure because the people who get into these policy-producing seats, they're generally, smart, right-thinking folks, not too motivated by politics writ large. They're thinking hard about these issues and trying to do the right thing. And I don't know. I'm hoping. This election season has been odder than most, but I'm hoping whoever becomes the next president will appoint the same type of people.
Yeah. Well, at least Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have obviously spoken before on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but it is an understatement to say that things have been interesting. For the last question, I sort of want to shift gears here and talk about a big picture issue that I know occupies my mind a lot, and that is this. We're nearing the 40-year anniversary, I guess you could say, of the FCPA, and to my knowledge, in the 40-year history of this law, the Department of Justice has only been put to its burden of proof twice in close to 40 years by a business organization. And ultimately, it lost both of those cases. Do you think the time has come with what many people view as ever-expanding enforcement theories for a third time to exist, perhaps a business organization under FCPA scrutiny based upon an aggressive enforcement theory to finally say enough is enough, and Department of Justice, if you think we violated the FCPA, will prove your case in court?
Yeah, I would love to see it in the right case. And that right case would be where the department is building inference upon inference from what scant evidence it might have. And we've seen cases in the past where the evidence, you just got the sense that there was just not enough there to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. But the companies wanted the case to go away, wanted the investigation to go away, and we're faced with a DOJ saying, okay, well, we may not be able to indict you today, but we're just going to keep trying to find evidence, and this thing might go on forever. And companies want to sort of put themselves out of misery. So they agree to a plea or a DPA or, even a non-prosecution agreement. So certainly there will be those cases in the future. It would probably take a company who, from the outset, decides it's not going to cooperate with the DOJ. It's not going to voluntarily disclose. It's not going to cooperate once the DOJ finds out about the potential misconduct. Companies will have to respond to subpoenas and so forth, but there's a difference between just responding to a subpoena and full cooperation. So it would probably take a company like that to ultimately fight it out at trial, because once you've started cooperating, you've made admissions, you've given the government evidence that it might not otherwise be able to get. Overseas evidence is what I'm thinking of. So it would probably have to be a company that thinks from the outset that they're going to fight this one. And it would probably not be a public company. It's harder for public companies to face the scrutiny of not cooperating with the government and fighting it out at trial. And as you know, many of the companies who have been the subject of FCPA prosecutions have been public companies, and it's just much more challenging for them to do so than for a privately owned company.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the dynamics relevant to the FCPA, of course, are dynamics present in other areas of law. And if MetLife can recently challenge the government's designation of it as a banking institution, if FedEx can fight back against DOJ criminal charges, which FedEx is currently doing, if some other publicly traded companies can do it outside the FCPA context, I do think it would be interesting to see what would happen in the FCPA context. Again, it hasn't happened with any level of frequency over the 40-year history of this law, but I guess time will tell to see what might happen in the future.
Yeah, so, no, I totally agree. I was involved in the defense of W.R. Grace in an overreaching environmental criminal prosecution where W.R. Grace took the indictment. 5 executives were also indicted, and everyone was acquitted at the end of the day in a courtroom in Missoula, Montana, because the proof just was not there. So I agree, it's very possible, but it'll take a certain type of case and a certain type of company to challenge.
Yeah, and from my perspective, that's just kind of old-fashioned how justice is supposed to operate, where if you think someone has committed a crime, you either charge them or you don't charge them. And if the person on the other side, whether it's a company or a person, disagrees with that, well, you do have a formal system where someone other than the Department of Justice has a role. So it will be interesting. And thank you for joining us and talking about not only that last question, but for the most part, the pilot program. Again, you have an experience in this area that few can claim, given your vantage points from the 3 different vantage points you have: DOJ, law firm and private practice, and then in-house. So when Billy Jacobson speaks on the FCPA, I pay attention because of those 3 vantage points, and listeners would be wise to pay attention as well. So thank you very much.